Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call to order the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force Steering Committee meeting for, September 24th, 2020. Members present are Erickson, Arlene Fell, Dan Hamill, Van Deacon, Jack Lanier, Stephen Glockley. We have guest Jed Holmes from the Executive's Office and our staff person, Jill Nixon. Thanks for being here this morning. Our first item is an update on crisis response efforts, ground level response and coordinated engagement, and the crisis assistance helping out on the streets, the CAHOOTS program. So I'll kick this off. A lot of discussion taking place right now about different co-responder models that the county might be able to put into place. And we had a good discussion yesterday in the EMS Executive Oversight Board about how the community paramedic program with the GRACE program and how that might expand countywide. Just a lot of spitballing and throwing some ideas out there. But I think in the end that we're going to come up with something that takes a lot of the elements of CAHOOTS and blends it with GRACE. Who knows exactly what it's going to end up like, but I know Ann's been working on this diligently, and we're creeping towards something. We just don't quite know what it is yet. Do you have anything to add, Ann?
I think what I would want to ask this group is what the expected goal is, not the process by which we get there, meaning I know there's talk about alternative, maybe unarmed dispatches or a co-responder model that's separate from something else. Those are all processes for how we get to the goal. But I wonder if this group could help identify what the ultimate goal is for any improvements or new developments we create.
Well, I think one of the top goals is to have law enforcement get out of the business of dealing with some of these things that they deal with that's been kind of thrust upon them. You know, the behavioral health issues, substance abuse issues, homelessness. There's a lot of things that could be done with a caseworkers level personnel rather than law enforcement. So there'd be, objectives to satisfy the community with that kind of a model. And another one obviously would be cost. There would be, it's a much cheaper staffing position if it's not law enforcement, because that's probably the top of the ticket as far as cost. So there's just a lot of good reasons to really try to go down that road. And I think the number one though is for the community itself. You get somebody that's trained in behavioral health or substance abuse rather than an officer that isn't. Ann, did you hear Roger's hearing on? I didn't. I had to leave at 3, but I thought one of the interesting things was that they just talked about how we just keep piling these tasks onto law enforcement, and because we don't know where else to put it, I guess. But I think what we're trying to do here is envision a better way of providing that service to our community. So those are my thoughts anyway. Dan, do you?
Yeah, Stephen had his hand up before I did, though.
Oh, okay. He's way back in the distance there. Stephen, go ahead.
Well, actually, my question is a little bit to the side of Ann's, so I'm glad to defer for the continuation of this discussion and then raise my point if you'd like.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'll go then. So Barry, you said it best. Everything you just said, I totally agree with. So I'm not going to restate what you just said. The thing that I would add to it is that I'd like to see a diversion with similar numbers to Eugene, Oregon, of up to 18, maybe even 20% diversion to behavioral health away from law enforcement. It hasn't happened here, but Shoreline has a program called Radar, and I forget what it stands for, but it's a program for officers to de-escalate when they encounter a person with a behavioral health crisis who's really in kind of a real challenging situation. And so we don't want, and I think that came from a shooting that happened a while ago, several years ago. We don't want anything like that to ever happen, obviously. And I'd like to think our officers are, well trained, and that wouldn't happen. But if we can send the crisis responders, the nurses, it's just a better response, I think, for the person. And what I want to see is the Portland model here, or the one that they're talking about, with the second van that shows up with the community health worker that can work towards a little bit longer of kind of working things out with the staying back or behind with that person and trying to work through the situation beyond a triaging situation, which the nurse and the DCR would do when they first get there. So that's kind of, I know you didn't want to get into a lot of process, Ann, but I'm just telling you what I want to see in a program.
Arlene?
So I've been thinking about this for a really long time. And it's a really big question. The shorter part of the question is these services that you're creating are the front end of providing mental health and addiction services and social services to our community. And that's very important, which is, to me, that's the encatchment. We're catching the problems as quick as we possibly can. But as far as, Ann is concerned, she's got two sides to this problem. One is the front end to help prepare the people who are going to do the evaluations in terms of their training requirements and so forth, but also to do what she can to expand the number of services that we have for these people that we are trying to help to actually get the help that they need afterwards. So even though that part is not part of the question I think that you're asking right now, I want to suggest that it's really important at some point for us to get to that piece.
And just in response to that, I would say that we want to make sure that we don't build out just one part of the system so far beyond the ability to connect with the rest of the system. It's kind of like what you said. If we don't have that balance, then it isn't helpful. If you have a robust response system but no place to refer them to,
right,
then it's just not effective. We won't reach our goal. I mean, we may reach the goal if law enforcement wasn't involved, but the calls will keep coming, right? So
right,
it's all about building, and I've used the war adage, sadly, but you can't, you don't put your front line out ahead of your supply line, or you got nothing.
Right, yeah,
Right.
no, absolutely. Stephen?
Thank you. I would just note that I think there's overwhelming feedback from the community, a lack of trust when law enforcement is involved in these kinds of responses. You have enhanced safety issues, overreactions, people, whether for mental health consequences or for immigration involvement, you have aversion to even calling emergency responses for many people. And so I think there's both a trust and an effectiveness goal to be sought there in responding to community input.
So that piece is really important because that ties into the racial equity and fairness issue that we're about to begin talking about, which is to be sure that staff are trained really thoroughly in examining their cultural biases or their ethnic biases, or just to get more training about how to communicate better with people that are of different backgrounds than yourself. It's a weak area in this community.
Dan Hamill has his hand raised.
Yeah, Dan, go ahead, then Mike.
Sure, thanks. Arlene, your point's well taken. Two things I want to add to this. One is that Representative Rammel and Shoemake both support what we're doing. So I've reached out to them and asked for their support and received it. So they're supportive at the state level. And I believe that we need to continue advocacy with the county and the port. Behavioral health is a shared policy priority for all 3 units of government. We will continue to ask for state dollars. We know that the real money is at the federal level, and I have zero confidence until, you know, maybe next year things change. The other piece is that building this is what we can do. Building a 911 co-responder. I just got off the lead law enforcement assisted diversion call right before this. Community paramedic, PACT, MCOT, behavioral health. Those are things that we can actually work on locally that we have control over. And so to answer another part of Ann's question, what are we trying to do here? I'd like to build out the system as best as possible on the front end so that when our advocacy efforts are successful at the state level and we get some more dollars for behavioral health, that those pieces can connect. And that's important to me to do that at the front end. And we're not going to solve every problem, but I believe that we will solve a lot more with this type of co-responder.
Can oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to, I was going to add to Arlene's comment about training, and this is not my idea. I've heard from some others, way more expert than me, that actually working in law enforcement, that also think that they need to look at recruitment and selection practices of officers. So to some degree, we can train and we can skill build. And I think that's really true. And those are really important things. I would advocate too, though, that fundamentally, we also have to look at when we're onboarding, what skills are we demanding, drawing, what are we seeking, and who are we hiring? And it may be that we have a lot of complex needs for officers, and we may not always be selecting and recruiting. So training may not be the panacea. It doesn't mean that it's not really valuable and super important. And I've heard from people taking training that it's been very powerful for them. I just want to say that sometimes real change may even go deeper.
Yeah. Arlene, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was thinking of an example, a smaller, well, it's not really small, but an example of what we're trying to talk about. When I was reading the notes for the agenda for this meeting, I saw there was a discussion about Sheriff Elfo's needs in regard to delivering people for emergency services. And so I guess that's one of the questions that I have about what we have available, which is the officers sometimes pick up people who are suicidal or severely intoxicated. Some are violent, some have psychosis, and some are at danger of running away in their dangerous conditions, which would mean that we need some sort of a secure receiving system. And that's the piece I really don't know if we have that. And I know that the officers are needing that, because if we need officers, that's why we need them, because the person is perhaps out of control.
Yeah, yes, there's certainly circumstances where, you know, things have to have a law enforcement there because of exactly what you said, but there's a multitude of other times that that's not necessary.
Right, I understand that. But the thing is that even if it's just a caseworker who's going out, there are times when they need security, but I'm suggesting that some clients need to be taken to a secure place.
Yeah.
So that is the goal of the new Crisis Stabilization Center, the mental health side of the house, is that it is an involuntary facility, not under the civil code, but under the criminal code that will allow peace officers to hold somebody up to 12 hours.
So you are going to be doing that.
That is the goal.
The goal, okay.
Well, it's all about the MCOs, whether or not they're going to fund it enough, and if not,
Okay.
how else we do that. Law enforcement will be incredibly disappointed and upset if we don't achieve that. From the very beginning, I have no doubt we'll get there. I just hope we get there right at the start.
Gary,
Yeah,
Stephen Gockley has his hand raised.
okay, just a minute. I lost everybody.
You muted yourself.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen. I got to get my screen back. I did something weird.
Thank you, Barry. I'm going to bring up my other point because I think it's moved more toward the center of this discussion. We've referenced a lot of discussion going on some of these questions. I periodically bring up, and I'm going to bring up again, that those aren't taking place in the task force. And I think what we're looking for is some consensus, if not recommendations, out of the task force. And so there's a need here, as there is in many issues, to educate the task force as a whole. In particular, I have a request from one of the members of the task force to have a presentation on the Cahoots program. When I checked in with Dan about that, he said it's extremely hard to get a hold of them. So I don't know what sort of roadblock that poses to us, but there are some of these conversations that I think need to be summarized but replicated for the whole task force. Presentations to understand what our choices are, presentations to understand pros and cons of any particular programmatic initiative, and I'd like to put forward that that request for a Cahoots presentation, even if it's from somebody like Ann or a knowledgeable local source of information. And then for us, as we talk about these issues and those conversations go on in other forums, to think about how to translate that back so that the task force as a whole can stay apace with the content of the conversations we're having.
Well, it sure makes a good case for having a month, every month meeting, doesn't it?
I think so.
Yeah. Ann, go ahead.
I'll be unpopular here for a moment, but I just think we run the risk of putting the cart before the horse if we start bringing in presentations from a lot of different programs. I think that the sheriff's office in Eugene, Oregon, just sent us, we have a document from them that basically is providing significant data on their program and correcting some of the optimistic data that has been put out by different sources. And so they felt compelled, since they were getting the same request from many people to present, that they would put out a document. And I will share that with you, Jill, for distribution to this group. But my point is this: we have a lot of resources in our town. We have a lot of different programs that might be able to be expanded or enhanced to provide, reach some of the goals we're looking for. And we also have a very limited set of resources in the sense that our behavioral health agencies are losing clinicians and case managers. It is hard to find people to do this very, very complex and risky work. And that from our point of view, when we're developing or expanding programs, we really have to take into account all those things and then create programs from what we have. And my worry always is when we bring in another model, you know, it's just might pull us off course. It might create a false promise. I don't know if we can do a Cahoots model. We haven't gotten far enough to complete our needs assessment or our inventory of resources to see if it's even possible. And so those are just my concerns, and that I would rather talk more like we are today about what are the base goals we're looking at, what do we think is achievable in terms of getting to those goals, what are the components needed to get to those goals. So not just a 911 diversion alternative, but, you know, what do you do after a caseworker comes on site, and what resources do they have, and, you know, building out the rest of the system. So that's just my 2 cents. Actually, that was probably 25 cents worth, but
It was a good work. Yeah.
but that's really what I'm concerned about, leading us down a path when we're not even close to that yet.
Barry?
Yeah, go ahead. What, Jill?
Dan Dan Hamill, then Stephen Gockley, then Jack Hovenier have their hands raised.
Okay, we're going to need to get off this topic and move on, but let's go ahead and those that had their hands raised, go ahead. Who's first? I can't see those hands.
Dan
Yeah.
Hamill.
Dan, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm gonna be unpopular with Anne here for a second. So the genie will not go back into the bottle. This thing has been released. The community, we've gotten tons of letters and correspondence and text and in-person, socially distanced, by the way, communication in support of this program. People want this, and I'm responsible to my constituents. Those are my bosses, and I have to listen to them. And I totally hear you in terms of like not building a bunch of stuff and taking stuff away, robbing Peter to pay Paul, or having it just not work. But as a policymaker, I'm not the how person. I'm the what and the why person. So the what is that we have this problem, why we need to address this problem in our community. The how part, we're going to try to figure out, and I'm going to get out of my lane with you and others, with the mayor in October to try to figure stuff out. I know that there's an entity in this community that's that I'll be meeting with here at 2:00 this afternoon. That's said that we're interested in being the operator on this one. And the Grace folks I know had talked about doing the architecture on this model. I think we're way further ahead than Eugene was in 1989. And so I'll stop there, but I'm just saying we're going to do some version of this, and we're just going to have to figure out how to do it.
Stephen?
I don't disagree particularly with anything Ann said, but the question that I got for the Cahoots presentation came because it is our public bodies that are raising Cahoots. That's what we've been talking about, and that's why people are asking about that. If we want to take a broader goal-oriented approach and not, and weigh the pros and cons of any particular program, people need to know about those pros and cons. That's all I'm saying. These conversations, to the extent the task force plays any role in them, and I would strongly say we need to play a role in them, the task force needs to be informed on whatever level we decide to engage with the question of 911 diversion.
I think we need to devote a whole lot more time to this subject next time we meet, because we have a lot to get through today, but good discussion. I think that...
Harry, can I still make my comment?
Oh, go ahead, Jack. I'm sorry.
No problem. So I agree with what I believe was Ann's concern, that we don't want to telegraph false hope. That the challenge in having presentations, whether it was when Seattle came up and talked about the programs that they're doing or talking about Cahoots, some may infer that that is an adoption of the program. I think, however, particularly with, let's use Cahoots, it's been in the paper, it's being talked about a lot in the city of Bellingham, people are aware of it, that to inform the task force so there's a baseline of understanding what it is. I mean, if there was a quiz on Cahoots, I'd probably get a D. I could BS my way through it a little, but I actually don't know enough about it to have an intelligent conversation. So I think having a baseline of comprehension about it makes sense, but I believe that part of Ann's point, at least, of framing it in a way that we're not saying at this point that we have resources to do it or can do it. We're trying to understand what some of the possible positive impacts in criminal justice and other communities, which may or may not be useful in ours, that I think could have some value to the task force. So for the purpose of the task force agenda, which is in part what this group is here, well, it really is what this group is here for, but our principles of what we're doing inform what's on the agenda. So the conversations of what we're going to do inform what the agenda is comprised of. I think some conversation about Cahoots, so there is an understanding, is okay, but I would hope with the task force we could veer away at this time from too much of the pros, the cons, other than, maybe that would be nice if we can implement it, but I don't think we're at a place where we're debating whether we can have Cahoots. We're at a place where we're trying to understand it, and then perhaps understand how we can integrate it in our community. Now, Dan, I think you're a little further ahead than I am on that. I heard what you said, conversations with the mayor, and it's going forward. But for the task force, at least, I don't know that everyone's quite there yet. So in summary, I support a conversation about what Cahoots is. primarily framed as an understanding of what Cahoots is, and perhaps a separate conversation of how we might integrate that into our system. And if Bellingham or someone else is doing something with it, understanding what they're doing with it would be helpful as well. That's it for me on this. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Okay, let's move on to the update on the membership. We have a kind of a loosely drafted generic ordinance that we're kind of working from. And Dan, I got an email from someone that had talked to you about wanting to join the task force.
It was a woman whose son came through the local criminal justice system. She's a citizen advocate, basically.
Okay. So I got that, and I was thinking that we were going to be talking about that today. And Jill, what did we want to kind of wring out of this discussion today on this ordinance? We weren't going to just go step through it and try to draft it today, right?
No, so there are two proposals. One is to add language, and let me put this up on the screen so you all have it, about incorporating racial and ethnic population into the task force. And the second is Anne's request to reinstate a position for the North Sound Behavioral Health ASO.
Okay.
Jill, is this the current, oh no, this is draft, I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Did we take the ASO or the BHO out?
It was removed after the last task force restructure.
Okay, thank you. And just to say briefly, I would like to reinsert it because I believe that the personnel they have and the money they have and their role as the behavioral health crisis response system administrator for the public sector is really critical to our work, especially some of the things we just got through talking about.
Barry, Stephen Gockley has his hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Stephen, you're muted.
How's that? Sorry.
Better.
I'll be disappointed if we don't adopt something very close to the as much as possible proportionality language. But as to the ASO, we didn't exclude them. That's when we added the additional appointed members. They are one of the health and social services providers. I don't know if they didn't have interest when we made that structural change. I don't remember a great deal of active participation when we used to have an ASO representative on the task force. So I guess theoretically, I see why Ann wants to target them, but as a practical active participant, I wonder about that.
I think that was probably a personnel issue more than anything else. And it could have been my oversight that I didn't even notify them about the health and social service sector role. I'm fine with, actually, I would rather have them as a designated position given their administrative role in our region.
So are we adding a task force member, or do we want to reduce the health and social services providers to 3 from 4?
Any thoughts on that?
Well, I have a standing thought. I'm not in favor of expanding the total. I think the task force is pretty large, and from a group size perspective, this philosophy has rippled for me for the last 5 or 6 years. I'm not at all opposed to adding the North Sound. And I'm very much in support of racial diversity or demographic diversity, but I have a philosophical opposition to putting a lot more chairs at the table. So there are ways to achieve those goals, I think, without seriously expanding. And we had this conversation 12 to 18 months ago when we redid the task force. I think we added 3 or 4 seats, something like that. And I spoke against it then and will continue to say that from a process perspective, I would rather see people involved in the subcommittee. I mean, I think the task force is pretty big, and you run the risk when you have 30 people on a group or 40 or 50 of being less effective. So that's my basic philosophy on that.
Dan Hamill has his hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I support what Jack just said. I also support item 34 and items 45 and 46 in what we're looking at right here. The one thing that I think that we were kind of missing the boat on, and maybe we reduce somewhere to make to maybe accommodate if we end up doing this, but we don't have anyone from Bellingham School District on our task force, and I think all of our can you do that? And all of our conversations about prevention, we still have yet to invite the largest, manager of children, I guess is not the best way to say it, but the local school district to the table. And that district has a lot of expertise on behavioral health issues and all kinds of emerging things with kids. So I don't know if that's, if it'll make the cut, but I wanted to voice that. I think we're just missing the boat on that one.
Arlene. We can't hear you, Arlene.
I'm a member of that advisory board and have been for several years. So at the moment, you have someone.
Dan, or excuse me, Mike.
Thanks, Barry. Just want to second to what Dan said. We had a speaker at our behavioral health subcommittee directly from the schools. It was extremely powerful and very useful. I want to acknowledge Jack's point, and I think he's correct. Group dynamics can be really challenging. On the other hand, I think the risk from not being inclusive, from not maybe customizing our approach, from not facilitating testimony and participation from underrepresented groups is a gross error. And I think it's a more gross error than having too many cooks in the kitchen. I can deal with a messy kitchen. And I think we have to deal with a messy kitchen. So Jack, with all due respect, I totally hear you. And I know what that's like with large groups and you get people not coming and we would have to deal with that. We would have to be able to deal with Jack's concerns because he's spot on. But on the other hand, look at the challenges that we get by, and I don't want to say being exclusive, because I don't think this group has been exclusive, not from what I've seen. In my short tenure, I don't see exclusive behavior, but I know that we are not, our results aren't there in terms of getting some of these marginalized communities, some folks not there, which means we need to keep at it. And it's not about what we didn't do right. It's just about let's go forward and let's do it now. And I think, you'll hear from me later. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but this is a huge part of racial equity and racial equity frameworks is who's at that table. And it's so critical. And if we start minimizing or have a goal in mind of a set number beyond which we won't be effective, that's a very difficult standpoint to begin looking at the composition when you're really looking at, boy, we need voices. We need to be inclusive of voices. And it's messy. Democracy is messy. So I want to second Dan's point. I think that direct lens, and Arlene, thank you for representing, but I think you also wear multiple hats because you have such valuable insight for our committee on your behavioral health and working with adults has been powerful. And on 45 and 46, I too am supportive. I would like stronger wording. And I really hope that somewhere we can not only have wording that says as much as possible, but that really states that we will do it. And if the way in which we are currently convening, meeting, or soliciting participation is not amenable to some of the groups, then we will find new ways. And there were some great suggestions, Dan and Barry and some others and Stephen who are at our behavioral health, the brainstorming around what might it look like that maybe wasn't all committee membership, but there might be ways that this group can get some of this feedback and participation. So Jack, I would offer that. we could think more broadly, and maybe it's not just, you know, a number of representatives, maybe different venues altogether. Some ideas that were brought up are like twice annual symposiums, focus groups, just some different things. So I just want to throw out there that I love that we're talking about this. I think this is extremely important. And I think it's so important that we're going to want to spend some time on it.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know what our goal is today other than, you know, just to kind of establish this conversational framework we're putting around this. But we're certainly not at a point where we want to present a draft to the council. So what's suggestions on next steps here?
Jack has his hand raised.
Jack?
Two suggestions. I suggest we move forward the language we have, and I have no objection if there's a reasonable way to strengthen lines 45 and 46, that's fine. I will just remind people that at least with our indigenous populations, we made many efforts. We put people on the task force, and despite offering to adjust times and do whatever, you know, to accommodate, Jill and I just weren't successful. And I think the best we can do is make it as open and welcoming an environment as we can. I agree with Mike said. I even agreed with the messy kitchen thing and a consensus thing. I would have probably gone along with Add 5 because I agree that's a bigger, I'd rather deal with a messy kitchen and have the voices than not have the voices. But the one thing that's cool about this task force is I really think we've done a great job of putting a lot of the work in the subcommittees, and I have no desire to stop the size of the subcommittees, and we can appoint people there all the time. So when I'm talking about the ordinance positions of the permanent members, that to me would be different if they were the only members, but the people in the community and the stakeholders and the advocates that want to participate, I think if we got people who want to participate, let's find a subcommittee. Let's let them work. And I don't see any need to put much of a cap on that on anything I've seen. So I do think there is an option to be on the task force and participate that's different than the permanent members when we have our short meetings for the full task force. Thanks.
Okay.
Buckley has his hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen. Unmute, Stephen.
I'm sorry. I think we've got two sorts of questions here because the North Sound ASO got thrown in here. I'm going to put that aside for a second and say, I think along the lines of Mike's comment, I feel that the racial equity questions are enormous in scope and overwhelming in their urgency, and they need to be tackled pretty comprehensively by the task force. I'd like to suggest that maybe you asked where we go from this conversation. Perhaps we could recommend to the task force the formation of an ad hoc racial equity committee to deal with questions like this. It would range from ordinance amendment to how we might recruit voices with lived experience and community members who care about incarceration prevention and reduction from all sorts of different angles, and really charge that group with working through some of these pretty complicated questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation and efforts around the racial equity idea. As you know, some of them are a racial equity commission. That's something I've been kind of working on in the background to see how that might look. So the one thing that concerns me is, do we get too many kitchens going on that subject without any kind of a coordinated focus? It's because it's a great idea to take this up, obviously, and it's timely and it's our society needs it. But you know, if we have a dozen groups trying to figure this out on their own, I'm kind of afraid how that rolls out.
I'm just trying to take it up within the scope of the task force itself. I don't think we're going to be particularly well served by an overarching countywide racial equity commission, I think the scope of the charge for that kind of body would not address our functioning and our advisory role to the council. So I was just thinking of tackling racial equity questions in how we function and the focus of our work as a task force.
Arlene? You're muted.
I think we should make this decision now and not form a committee and not study it any further. I think we have to have representation. And I also suggest that we not do it the way it was suggested, but the members be full members, because it would imply a secondary position. And that's the whole piece of the puzzle that we're dealing with. Whoever comes in should be on an equal footing. And I would like us to make that decision now.
Mike?
Arlene, that was beautifully said, and my eyebrows went up because you made me think. I didn't think about it from the perspective of optics and how important that is and what message that would send. I just want to thank you for bringing that up, because that you widened my own thinking, and I appreciate that. The second thing that I'm hearing from some of us, and maybe not all of us, but is this great sense of urgency. And again, it's urgency to begin the work of being more equitable in our analysis, as we vet proposals or our advice to those that are going to take our advice and possibly implement programs. There's no time like the present. There's just no time like the present. And I think we can do it and then learn from it and keep going. So I think sometimes we may be guilty of wanting to just bake it totally perfect, but I think we can be okay with the mess on this one. So I would just like to echo the sense of urgency. I too think we need to act. And I think if we need to amend what we did because it wasn't fully figured out, that's okay. But I think people want to see that we're addressing that issue. And the work of this task force and some of the things that have been implemented are amazing. And I think we can continue that amazing work and do even better.
Hey, Mike, is this a good spot to launch into your agenda item on promoting racial equity?
I'm happy to do that. It might give some of the members just a little bit more familiarity with at least what I was advocating this group do. I'm happy to do that, Barry.
It kind of makes sense to me to kind of add to this discussion on the points that you're bringing to the table this morning. We could go a little bit out of order and take number 5 before number 4, because I think, we're right there in our discussion now. So if anybody doesn't have an objection, I would like to have Mike go ahead and run us through what he has to say about racial equity this morning. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, Jill, I'm going to ask your favor yet again to allow me to share my screen if I could.
A moment to promote you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, there you go.
Okay. And okay, can everybody see that?
No.
Okay. Give me just a second. And let's try this. How about that?
Yep.
Yes, thank you, Mike.
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me to do this. I apologize. I see a couple of faces on here that have already heard this, so my apologies to you. I also want to just mention that I'm acknowledge that I am not the best person to be bringing this argument to you. There are folks with lived experience. I'm a person of pretty big privilege in terms of my skin color, in terms of how I'm treated, and in terms of how I've been treated in the justice system. So I want to acknowledge that there are people that are better than me to bring this to you, but I'm here, I'm motivated, and I'm really passionate about this, and I'm such a big fan of this work. I really think that this is going to just capacity build us and turbocharge us, not slow us. and not be a challenge. So really quickly before I begin, the organization that this comes from is the Government Alliance on Racial Equity. And City of Seattle is one member that's close by. There are lots of members, and there are lots of ways in which one can engage with GARE, as it's known. One of the easiest ways is a racial equity tool. And when I became exposed to this concept, and we were working at this at Opportunity Council, it just seemed like such an amazing fit and something that we might be able to act on quickly and that could really start helping us now. Let's see if I can advance my slide. Pardon me, I gotta figure out my, okay. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm not an expert on Zoom presentations. So just to briefly remind people, obviously we're all here because we want to reduce incarceration. It's in the name of our task force. We're hearing in listening sessions and from protests that we all want a criminal justice that keep us safe. We want a society where our children thrive and prosper. And we want a system that's just and equitable for all. One of the ways that we know, though, that this is not happening is we have data. So what I'm sharing with you is from the Prison Policy Initiative, and this is nationwide data, but we know we have our own challenges here in Whatcom, and our index committee has been very helpful in showing us where we're doing well and where we're not. So just sharing with you that 64% of the US population identifies as white, but they're only 39% of the prison population. African Americans are 13% of the total US population, and yet they represent 40% of the prison population. This is not fair, it's not equitable, and those people don't have their parents because they're in jail. So we're failing in some ways when we do not address this issue. I also want to share with you this concept. This was really telling for me because I remember things that were considered kind of race neutral, and even stop and frisk policies at some point were considered race neutral. Just share this from Ibram Kendi, if folks have read this. If you haven't, do. I'm planning to. How to be an anti-racist. But there's no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. Every policy in every institution, in every community, in every nation is either producing or sustaining racial inequity or equity. It's really mind-bending for me. I wanted to share that because I think that's really key. Being well-meaning and not asking the question, we can be perpetuating things we didn't create. And that's really important, I think, for the work of this task force. The task force has, I guess, a decision in front of it, which we're discussing today and steering, but we can be leaders in the change in our system. I really see that this group has been exerting that leadership since 2015. Jack, correct me if I'm wrong, but December of 2015, this group was formed, and some of the wins that have come out of this are really amazing. But a racial equity toolkit can help an organization or a task force such as ours really move the needle in terms of racial equity. So why would we want to do this? This, by the way, is all directly from the organization called GARE, the Local and Regional Government Alliance on Racial Equity. I'm just going to read you one of these. Too often policies and programs are developed and implemented without thoughtful consideration of racial equity. When racial equity is not explicitly brought into operations and decision-making, the racial inequities are likely to be perpetuated. Racial equity tools provide a structure for institutionalizing the consideration of racial equity. This particular tool, and why I'm pitching this particular one, by the way, it's free, so nobody makes money off this particular one. Membership is a whole nother thing. But GARE's racial equity tool proactively seeks to eliminate racial inequities and advance equity. It helps organizations identify clear goals, objectives, and measurable outcomes, something this group already very much values. It helps us better engage community in decision-making processes, and it actually charges us to do so. It assists us in identifying who will benefit or be burdened by a given decision, examines potential unintended consequences of a decision, and develops strategies to advance racial equity and mitigate unintended negative consequences. The last thing we want to do is propose some great reform, and yet it has horrible, unequal output for a given group and furthers that. Finally, it helps us develop mechanisms for successful implementation, and most importantly, the evaluation. Did we do what we wanted to do? Are the right people being where they need to be? And are we keeping the people that do not need to be incarcerated out of jail? So very briefly, what is a racial equity toolkit? It's kind of a big, powerful word, and it's kind of can be a charged concept. But I want to share with you what my research has showed me, and like I said, there are people way more skilled in this than me, but it really is a simple set of questions. There are lots of these online. Jill looked a bunch up, I looked a bunch up, and there are so much similarities to them. So I'm not going to read all of these because you can see them, and I believe Jill is sharing the set of questions. But the simple set of question is, what is a policy you're doing? So what's the proposal? Number two, data. What's the data? What does that tell us? We have our own index committee that is helping us with that, and it's been so critical to this work. Community engagement. That's our discussion today. How have communities been engaged? Are there opportunities to expand engagement? And I would further, especially from folks that maybe are either underrepresented, oppressed, or severely affected in any way, I think are good categories to look at. Number four is analysis and strategies. So who's going to benefit? Who's going to be hurt? Implementation. What does it look like for your plan for implementation? And accountability and communication. How do you make sure that what you said you were going to do, you do? These probably seem very familiar, and they should, because we use a lot of this. But what we may not have done, and what a racial equity toolkit does, is you use this every single time you do that proposal. And it's the process that is absolutely critical, and you ask those hard questions. It is quite possible that many of the wins that this group has advocated for would stand this test just fine. It's also possible that we would get something really valuable from asking these tough questions. I would also add that a racial equity toolkit is just a tool. It's a beginning, and it would help us shape that kind of equity framework that we're making our recommendations in. And it provides very powerful information to move a task force such as this forward in a more inclusive and equitable process. So again, my apologies that you have me being the one bringing this, because this is not my expertise. I'm a social worker, I'm a white, but I'm really passionate, and I have great respect for the work of this group. And I believe that the steering committee should propose to the task force as a whole that we adopt a toolkit. I would love it if Whatcom County, City of Bellingham decided to be GARE members, but that's another step altogether. We can implement a toolkit that is free and available to us at any point that we want to. And I would just urge that we consider that, making that proposal today. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And if I do not know the answer, I would be happy to find the answer for anybody that's got something today. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. Any questions? Dan?
I'm going to move approval on this. I think that timing is as important as the content. This content is built for governments. It's free. We can move on it right away. And I think this task force needs to show leadership.
Yeah, I'll second that motion.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
can I ask for clarification on the motion, what exactly it is you're moving approval of?
I'm supporting the adoption of the GARE racial equity toolkit for the task force, or to recommend to the broader task force, sorry.
Discussion.
Just,
Yes, Ann, go ahead.
I'm assuming the next question that the task force would have is, so what are we doing now that we've adopted it? I mean, what work would we do within the task force? Do we do it in committees? I guess I just would like to provide some structure behind this so we can answer some of those how-to questions.
If I might speak to in support of my own motion. The way that I look at it is that slide in the deck that had the 1 through whatever it was, 6 or 7, it had those overlays. from introduction of the program, the concept of whatever we're talking about, all the way to the outcomes and the tracking of the data component. That's what I'm looking for in terms of how we make decisions through our processes. So we have that, we lay that over everything we do, both in committee and at the task force level. And that would at least ensure that we are looking through a racial equity lens.
Raylene.
I'm for a racial equity toolkit, and I really appreciate Mark Parker and all the work you've done in the presentation on this. The one thing that I do want to mention is we were hoping to get this at the last Law and Justice Committee, and it didn't happen. And so if we do submit it to the full task force as a whole, I would like to at least get this out to the committee members so that they could review it prior to the actual full task force meeting.
Stephen Gockley has his hand raised.
Yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
I think there would be a whole lot of issues for implementation of this decision if we make it that need to be addressed. I'd like to go back to the idea of an ad hoc committee to really dig in to do this. We can't do it in 20-minute or 30-minute chunks in the steering committee or in the task force. There needs to be a lot of implementation work done. And one place I'll particularly focus on is I too really appreciate the leadership Mike has taken on bringing this question forward. One of the glaring points to me in adopting a toolkit like this is its reliance on data at every step of the way. And I have a bit more sanguine view on how much we've accomplished through the index committee. I haven't seen much product, and I think we've been stalled there for lack of leadership since Tyler had to pull back. I think it calls for us to really activate and accelerate the role that the index committee can have in providing us the data we would need to make racially equitable, conscious policy decisions.
Jack Hovenier has his hand.
Yeah, Jack, go ahead.
All apologies to Dan, but I think the motion is a little rough. And, you know, a lot of people, if they're not hearing this discussion, don't know what it is. They only have the words in the motion. So while I'm supportive, I would recommend we clean up the motion a little. As an example, I would say something like recommend using the blank tool for recommendations of the IPRTF to the County Council and for recommendations of the IPRTF subcommittees and in the work performed by both. Something like that. I think it's a little bit vague. And I think it's important for people who aren't part of this conversation to be clear on what a motion is trying to accomplish.
I'll accept your friendly amendment.
Hey, Jill, do you have that language?
Jill, Jill, I'm typing it.
Okay.
I'm gonna clean it up a little.
Jack, would you be comfortable sharing your screen? I can promote you to do that.
Yeah, give me just a second. I'm not ready. I don't want you to see what's on my screen. I'm almost ready with the motion. Recommend the link tool. What's the name of the tool again? The
GARE, G-A-R-E.
G-A-R-E, sorry. Yeah, recommend using the GARE tool.
I would just add while Jack is typing about Stephen, if this group does see fit to honor his comment and request of us to create an ad hoc group to further elucidate kind of how this could be applied in some of the subcommittees, and really, I'm sorry that it didn't get to the legal one. There were good comments, people already thinking about, well, what would it mean for what we do? And that's really critical. It's not about doing, this is not a lip service thing. This is a process, a fundamental change, and it deserves a consideration for questions like that. What would it actually mean? How would we do things different? How would I apply it if I'm in a crisis stabilization group? And those are really important. So to Stephen's point, I do think there will need to be some work to facilitate, to help implement this toolkit and people know how to use it. And I would volunteer to be a part of any group if such is created to help in that work.
Okay.
Mike, yeah, I'm almost ready. Mike, before I share my screen, I think this motion would benefit from an intent. So the intent is to, do we want to say encourage racial equality in our task force processes? What would you say the intent is? Or is that too limited?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could do something a little bit better than off the cuff. I would probably research it. I usually do better when I research and then I speak from a space of knowing. Jack, I don't have the wording, but I would be willing to bet you that we could get some wording actually from Gare about the intention. I can just tell you that off the cuff, what it means for me is operationalizing a framework to ensure that all of the work, whether it be the composition of this group or the recommendations from this group, that all of those things have been analyzed and optimized to further racial equity in our system. But I'm sure there's better wording than mine. I hope that's somewhat helpful. Does that get at the intent?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, it is a racial equality toolkit. Okay, so I'm ready to share my screen, Jill, if you've promoted me. Okay. Oh, sorry. There we go. Oh, the Gare Toolkit.
I would only, I would say racial equity, not equality.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. I was just lifting it off the Gare. The reason I think this may benefit from an intent is these people that only see this, I'd like them to know why we're proposing it. And I don't know all the right words. I know in principle what we're trying to do, and I'm totally on board with that. But I think some little thing like that helps. It also helps subcommittees. If you have an intent with a motion, it helps them discern what was being recommended at times.
So is the idea then to have Mike give this same presentation then to the full task force? I would assume that's how we would.
Seems logical. If we make this recommendation, then I would think part of the presentation prior to the motion would be to Mike do the presentation, and then the task force would have this motion or something substantively similar.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I read it too. Ann?
And can we change your wording from encourage to support or to promote as opposed to encourage?
If there is anyone I like edits from, it's you. You were brilliant with words. Absolutely. Recommend.
In terms of the intent.
Oh, to support.
To
yeah, thank you.
Promote. It's just a little bit more action oriented.
Absolutely.
Makes us more accountable.
If any of you haven't worked with Ann on words, she'd be about my first. If we were picking like in school, I'd be picking Ann first.
Okay, well, it sounds like we have some steps forward, and which kind of leads me into our topic about communications.
Well, Barry, did you want to make a decision on that before we go on?
Oh yeah, I guess we got to vote on it, don't we? Sorry.
Here, let me throw it back on the screen so we can all see it. I mean, I think we have consensus, but let's make sure of that.
I'll call roll.
Okay.
Dan Hamill,
Aye.
Jack Hovenier,
Aye.
Raylene King,
Aye.
Mike Parker,
Aye.
Barry Buchanan,
Aye.
Ann Deacon,
Aye.
Arlene Feld. You need to unmute Arlene. Arlene, please unmute.
Aye.
Stephen Copley.
Aye.
Thank you.
And Jill, I emailed that to you verbatim, so you have it now.
Thank you.
Okay, so that passes unanimously. Going back, gosh, a couple of years, we've been talking about communications and how we really want to do a better job of getting the work of this task force out into the public. So we have a agenda item here today. And so Jill and I were talking about this, and we thought we would ask Sept Paul about his communications person, which is Jed, who has joined us this morning, on how he might be able to help us. And so I invited Jed this morning. We haven't had a conversation at all, so I don't know what his capacity is. But I know, Dan, you guys had talked about communication stuff in your subcommittee meeting, right?
That is correct.
Maybe we could start there and kind of see what the feedback and what ideas came out of that.
Sure. Hey, Jill, can you throw that up on the screen? Okay, I'm gonna get rid of the baby. Hold on. I just handed it off.
Give me a moment to pull it out.
Yeah, this is really about transparency. This is about trying to get the work of the task force out to the public. There's a lot of good work that happens within each subcommittee that is basically the level of opacity is not intentional. It is just a byproduct of government from my perspective. So I'm just trying to lead an effort here in getting the word out to folks as to what we're doing. We had some good suggestions over in Behavioral Health Committee about publishing maybe twice a year, having like an update that is kind of like the task force, the annual report, but maybe coming from committees to show that work that's being done there. Mike also had an idea, Hilly, that we might want to have kind of like a listening session, but also like a report out session, and invite members of the community to maybe ask questions and hold us accountable for the work that we do. And I'm all for that. Let's see, communications. So we talked about, outward facing communications. We now have these videos, which we didn't have before. We only had audio recordings. And so the question is, could we like broadcast these out on YouTube so that they become more public record? Let's see. Oh, and also making sure, I think Stephen Gockley brought up time notations that would correspond with these videos. So that way you don't have to scrub an hour and a half worth of video just to find the one subject you were interested in. So you just look at the agenda items. I think that was a really good piece. Mike Parker brought up live transcription services. Absolutely, for people who are with limited accessibility, we want to make sure that they have access to the work that we're doing. We also talked about perhaps hiring an outfit or a marketing person to develop some kind of communications campaign. And then the other bullets you see there. So taking some responsibility for our own selves and posting maybe on Facebook or other mediums, or just making sure that we're talking about the work that we're doing in the community. I think, I'll just leave it at that and open up for discussion.
Okay, comments on what Dan's just, Jed, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts just on kind of what you've heard today and just in communications in general, and how we might be able to be a lot more robust.
Yeah, well, first of all, communications is more productive when it's goal-oriented and there's something happened, right? Process like this meeting, the process sort of stuff is not that interesting to the public. You can put this up on YouTube and let people know that it's there. People can see how you're working. But I think the idea of having periodic reportings out, whether I know that you do those reports, but having some measurable goals, like what's, the task force has these particular goals in mind, and how are you getting closer to that? What's changing in government? What's changing and I know that those changes have occurred, and I've seen occasionally it's being reported in the paper. It's not getting, I don't think it's been attributed as much to the task force's work, and I think that's something that could be worked on. I think, I guess that's kind of where I'm at. I do have capacity to help, and if you have any requests, what to do. I think a lot of times, I don't know how you operate in terms of if you have designated speakers, and that's often a problem when you have a committee or a task force where who speaks on behalf of the task force or who's just speaking as a member of the task force and how that goes out. arranging interviews. If you want to get on the radio, if you want to get in the paper, you've got to have a result, right? A reason. And so, yeah, I'm open to your suggestions, and I know that Executive Sidhu wants me to help you guys.
Okay, thanks, Jed. Arlene.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My question to Jed is, do you use social media to get out this information? Because that's where people mostly are looking these days.
Yeah, you can, but it has to be interesting information. If I post a meeting announcement that there's a meeting's going to happen, the way social media algorithms work, that doesn't get very far. I don't know exactly.
Right. So if you say the meeting is addressing racial equity issues, that will get a response.
It may. I think you'd be surprised at how popular cat videos are compared to meeting announcements. And so it's difficult to catch people's attention.
Raylene.
Lost my arrow, sorry about that. Going back to Arlene and Jed, what about, I understand the algorithms with the social media and getting it as a capture, but I know a lot of the local police departments have social media pages, which people regularly go on to. Would that be more effective to put it out in certain pages, Whatcom News, so that people are looking for that?
Yeah.
Instead of just a general social media.
That, the more popular page you put it on, the better. But, if you look at, for example, the City of Bellingham's social media Facebook page, it has X number of followers. You look at the City of Bellingham's Police Department social media page, and I think it's maybe 3 times more. Why is that? Because the police department puts out stuff about, actions that have happened, things that are, results. It's not about, their Facebook page isn't about meetings. It's about, unfortunate things that have happened in our community, and it gets people to react. So social media is tricky that way. And even if you put something boring on a popular Facebook page, it doesn't get out. So I don't mean to be discouraging. It's just that the way to make more people recognize what you're doing, you have to have, some sort of hook. And usually that's in surprising information. It's information that's, gets people involved. So,
Dan.
Yeah, to your point, Ted, I guess I'm more concerned about some of the highlights that the task force and the subcommittees are able to hit in terms of goals and processes. So, for example, Crisis Stabilization Center is a game changer that's coming online this fall. Same for lead law enforcement assisted diversion. That's another good victory. We're talking about this co-responder model. So those are the things that I'm talking about. I'm not really necessarily talking about how we reached a decision or more process things. I think that's not going to happen. But it is really a goal to, what I heard during the listening sessions was that people were saying, hey, you guys aren't talking about children, and then really this person was very concerned about that. And actually I think called 2 or 3 times into the meetings. Well, the fact is that we have a whole team of people, multiple teams that are working on way upstream prevention, but we just don't have a way really to get that information out in front of the public. And that's my concern. And I realize we're not going to reach everybody, but I want to make sure that we do our level best to communicate outwards and to have a plan. And if that's engaging PD, Facebook pages, or whatever the modalities are, I'm fine with that. Whatever that, I'm less interested in the how and more interested in the what. And that is that we need to be better at communicating. And I'm trying to find the pathway forward. You're the expert. I'm not. So I'm I'm really thrilled that Executive Sadhu sees the value in the task force and communicating our work out to some degree.
Yeah, I would recommend taking an event like the opening of the Crisis Stabilization Center and saying, okay, well, how does the task force use that to get out its message? And we'd be happy to loop you in. I can say that, when was it? About a month ago, we went and did a tour of that, and we posted some photos, and people were really happy to see that's coming online soon. So if you want to use that as one of the hooks that get the community to pay attention, that's something we could plan for.
We overwhelmingly hear about this. There's a defund movement, and there's also more of a fund movement, which is like fund behavioral health. That is overwhelmingly like the #1 item in our community. So when we can show that we are not only responding, that we are ahead of the curve, and we have been working on these issues for quite some time now. They didn't materialize overnight. When we can demonstrate that to the community, I think that's reassuring. I think to some folks that we're taking this stuff really seriously, and we're working towards an outcome on this.
Mike, and then Jack.
So this question is a little bit for Jed, but one of the, as I hear Dan, I'm kind of thinking about like, well, where do people get their news, right? How do they absorb it? And who do we need to get this in front of? And obviously there may be people that consume news in different ways. For me, social media, that's not a way to get me. I go on once a month to see if my nieces and nephews are still around. So that's not my news source. And I guess, Jed, my question to you is for, maybe marginalized communities or folks that I think I want them to know even more, right? And be able to see into the window of what we do as best we can. Are you familiar with, varying strategies or campaigns that obviously maybe you pick the best and that gets in front of the most people? And I really like what you said about action items, because you're going to get somewhere. Is there anything or recommendations that you have from your standpoint that are particularly useful into getting in the hands of some of the folks that we need? Maybe into our local tribes, maybe into our lower income folks, maybe into folks with lived experience. I just wonder what you think about that, Jed, if you have any thoughts for us.
Yeah, I'd have to put some more thought into it. There are a lot of different channels you can use, and sometimes it's simpler. It might be like your high school newsletter, right? That goes home to the parents. There are a lot of different avenues that you can kind of jump onto, climb onto, and try to use those to get into, get in front of people. And there's right now there's the traditional mass market. But if we're not looking at that, if we're looking to get into target something, we have to put a lot of thought into that. And if you could come up with a list of, say, the types of people that you want to get this information out to, we could think of creative ways how to do that.
Jack.
Thanks. I had to do this hand because after I got promoted, I lost my ability to raise my hand.
Well, I can see
that's even better. It's real life. Thanks for joining us. Just a little bit of quick comments. You asked about spokespeople. So typically it's been the co-chairs, Stephen and I, although we've made exceptions. There have been times it's been the sheriff. At the Peace Builder Award, we asked the prosecutor, Eric Ritchie, and someone else to come with us. On the crisis stabilization facility, Eric Wilkinson and I at King 5 did a groundbreaking interview. And I did an interview with Eric last month on real estate, and he asked about the facility. So they're prepared to come up here for that. I assume that's me, or it's me and Stephen, or if it's the executive. I mean, I think the basic so far strategy has been generally it's the co-chairs, but we're happy to either step aside or go with, depending on the topic, because we may have someone better on the task force than us to represent that particular topic. So is that about your understanding, Stephen, of how we've done it? I think so. We have talked about it, and most task force members know they don't speak for the task force. And Stephen and I and Jill before him have been very careful, like when we were at City Club or doing some of those things, to speak for the task force, not our opinions. And Barry, before we go on, I need 2 minutes before the end to ask the group to make a slight change to the wording of the motion. I saw a kind of to me, it's a fatal error that we can quickly fix. Thanks.
Sounds good, Jack. We'll do that. Any other thoughts or questions or ideas about communications? Jed, thanks so much for being here with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, go ahead and send me your thoughts. If my email's probably out there, I could put it in the chat and be happy to respond to any sort of ideas or suggestions and build some sort of plan. And I saw on your list there, Dan, having a communications campaign of some sort, and I think I could help develop that if needed.
Thank you. We really need your help.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go ahead and deal with what Jack wants to deal with real quick and some rewording.
Problems with motions on the fly. I just noticed the original motion potentially limits the recommendation to recommendations to the county council. So I would recommend that this verbiage that says recommend using the GARE toolkit in the work of the IPRTF and their recommendations to the county council and in the recommendations and work of the IPRTF subcommittees. I just didn't want to have somebody think the scope was only limited to the recommendations to the county council. So I would just ask that we affirm that minor Scrivener's error. I don't think it changes it in substance. It's just better motion.
Does anybody have any objections to that?
No, that's fine. That's
Okay,
better.
Jill, we'll amend that just through unanimous consent.
Thank you.
Okay, the items for our October task force meeting. We have the land acknowledgement statement. That was a motion that we approved at the August steering committee, so we will be doing that at the beginning. We have a motion approved at the August steering committee to return to monthly meetings. So that'll be a discussion that we will have to have with the full task force. Have you thought about that at all, Jack? How you want to approach it? Just straightforward. There's not really any tricks to it, is there?
No, I mean, Stephen, I think that's just straightforward. Yeah.
Okay, and then committee reports. I mean, that's it. That's all we have on our agenda for this meeting to talk about in terms of the task force meeting. Any other things that anybody wants to add?
Barry,
Yes.
it was mentioned in this meeting today to include Mike Parker's presentation at the full task force meeting.
Yes. In conjunction with that motion that Jack just had up there. Anything else on task force agenda for October?
Yeah, Jill, I think for the task force, if Stephen is in concurrence, we would just introduce the support of a racial equality tool and explain this came about through discussions and a presentation from Mike Parker. We'll ask him to make his presentation, and then we would like the task force to consider the recommendation that was unanimously approved by the steering committee.
Sounds logical.
That seems fine to me.
Okay.
So Barry, the other thing we've talked about today is some, I don't think we're quite clear on the level of generality, but a discussion that would inform the task force about some of the considerations in 911 diversion program models and so forth. I don't know if we're ready for that in October or what, Dan or Ann, I don't know what you think.
That's a good point, Stephen. I've been thinking about that since about the past half hour and how we might package that. Any ideas? Are we ready, or do we need some more done behind the scenes and staff and some of those ideas kicked around? Ann?
I think we should at least inform people that there is action underway, that a lead facilitated process has been established, and there is a process underway to do the standard program planning, which includes needs assessments, inventory of resources, researching best practices, that kind of thing, just so they know something's happening.
Would you like to take that on?
I'm happy to do that.
That would be great. I think you're the closest to it. Thank you. Okay.
Hey, Barry.
Yes.
So our council voted 7-0 to direct the administration to create a budget proposal for this program at the city level. Where is your council on this? I know that you said you had a presentation that was done. What have you made any decisions at all?
No, we haven't. We just listed that. We did a whole, prioritization and what council members thought were their highest priorities, and that was one of them that floated to the top. Was this, co-responder kind of an idea, but it hasn't gone any further than that. Like I said earlier, we have talked about it at the Executive Oversight Board at EMS yesterday, quite extensively actually, and I know Executive Sadu is on board with moving forward, but we haven't talked about any firm, financial commitments yet.
Okay, I've got a WATCOM meeting in about a half an hour here, and I assume that it's not on the agenda, but I think that under old and new, we're going to be discussing that as well. So I agree with Ann Deacon. I think that just kind of outlining rather, where we're at in this process would be, I think it's fair, and I think the members need to be informed.
Yeah, as well as the community, definitely.
Barry, could I just add, I think there's a level of this that's a programmatic level, and Ann clearly would be the best spokesperson for that. But I think you've just touched on the fact that there's a council level public policy decision-making process going on this as well. And so I'd appreciate it if Dan and you, to a lesser extent, since your conversations are less far along, could at least provide a brief update on what council actions are in this area as well.
Sure, that's a good idea. We should always include those kind of policy discussions as they take place. Yeah.
When's the next full task force meeting? What's the date?
October 5th.
Okay, so that's unfortunately that's before the conversation with the mayor, which takes place I think on the 8th. It'll be a outline of what's been done to date. So that's fair. And then if we decide to go monthly, then we'll have another update for November, or if we go bi-monthly, it'll be December. But either way, we'll have another update beyond what the next one on the 5th.
Yeah. Sound like a plan, everybody? Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
Thanks. Can I just remind everyone that the next task force meeting after October is November 2nd. We had originally scheduled to have the task force work done in time for the councils to do their budgeting, but that was all pre-COVID. So just FYI, the next task force meeting after October is early November.
Yeah, that sounds good. So if we go back to our monthly schedule, we're aligned. Anything else on anything we talked about today before we go to public comment? Okay, I would open up if there's anyone out there in the public that would like to comment. You can raise your hands on the Zoom screen. Is there anybody, Jill, that's out there from the public?
No one has their hand raised.
Okay, so we'll close the public comment period. Anything else for the good of the order for our steering committee work? Thanks, everybody. I think we had a good productive session today, and look forward to seeing you all at the task force meeting. We are adjourned.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.